All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Restoring Report podcast. I'm super excited for the content we got planned up for you guys today. As always, this is a podcast for young believers who are pursuing the goal of marriage and family and trying to get married as young as possible in a healthy way. I'm your host, Seth Hensley. I come on twice a week, every week on Thursday and Sunday, to discuss not only the benefits of getting married young, but I attempt to equip and encourage you in your pursuit of that goal. And today we're going to be reviewing a video, an interview between Matt Fradd and Nick Freitas on the issue of how to build a stronger marriage and what the role that marriage plays for human flourishing. And I really liked listening to what I heard so far of this interview. I haven't listened to the whole thing. It's about 3 hours long, but there were several things in there that I really wanted to cover. First being his statement on the role women play in men's transformation and kind of what's being prescribed by culture to transform men and incentivize them to make something of themselves, I think are completely insufficient motivations. We often try to get men to pursue the hard road and get them to work hard and get them to make something of themselves and get them to get off of their couch or their bed or their video game bachelor pad and go out into the workforce by using things like independence as motivators, or things like money as motivators, or things like, a quiet, peaceful space away from family as motivators. All these things are things that I've heard used as motivators and incentives to get men to do the hard thing, go out into the workforce and make money. People will say things like, well, if you go out and you make some money, you can buy yourself a nice little apartment or a nice little home where you can be away from all the noise of your family and you can make your own rules. That's independence and that's isolation. We're using those two things as a motivator to actually get men to go into the workforce. Another thing that people will use as a motivator to get young men to go into the workforce is the opportunity to make money. So we'll say you won't have any money to spend on things that you like and things that you enjoy if you don't work, and therefore your life will be less meaningful and less fulfilled. So we're using money as a way to get men to go into the workforce and fight laziness, basically. And another thing that we'll use is just this idea that you won't need anyone. We'll say you should be ashamed of the fact that you're relying on somebody else, your parents, to provide you with shelter, food, and clothing. And therefore you should be ashamed of that, and you should go to the workforce so as not to be ashamed of the way you're living. All of those, I would argue, may be motivators for some people, but I think they're really poor motivators. And I think there are better motivators to get men to do hard things. Particularly, one of the best ways that you can actually get a man to do a hard thing is to give him a joy to protect and a treasure to run for that is far more valuable than the treasures that are being proposed by most of culture. And I would say the biggest one of the biggest ones, I would say God designed the biggest motivator for a man to be the joy of having a wife and children, the joy of having a wife to protect and love, and care for, and children to protect, love, and care for. And the joys that come with that are, I would say, and I would argue, one of the only joys that are sufficient motivators to get men to do hard things. And in this clip, you're going to hear Nick Freitas basically talking about, what role a woman plays in a man's transformation and betterment. And I'm really excited for this. I want to show you this, and then I'm going to go through an article that I wrote 4 years ago that relates to this issue and why it basically presents the case for why men should choose to get married. So let's go ahead and hear what Nick Freitas has to say on this. Really excited to hear what he has to say.
One of the things I told him was, I said, if you don't love Jesus more than my daughter, you will never be able to love my daughter the way that she requires and the way that she deserves from you. And he really demonstrated that he understood that he properly understood what his role was to be a leader within his household. Which is a good thing too, because we raised a very, very strong, very strong, capable daughter, mm-hmm. right? Because that's what we wanted. We wanted to raise a Proverbs 31 woman. Mm. And one of the things we'd always told our daughter is that you are not going to be happy with any man that you don't have an immense amount of respect for, both with their character and their capability.
This reminds me of something Jordan Peterson said that I thought was fantastic. He said, what do you want from a wife? He's like, do you want her just to sprinkle rose petals in front of you and pat you on the back and tell you're a good boy?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, yeah, sure. I'd like that for a few months. Whereas like, or do you want a woman who doesn't just see you, but sees the you that you can become and believe in that?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Isn't that wonderful?
There's there's kind of a flippant statement that men civilize the wild and women civilize men.
Okay.
When we were at Live Action with, Lila Rose.
Yeah.
And so Lila Rose, great, wonderful person, Live Action, great organization.
Indeed.
But one of the things I was talking about there is I was saying, to the young women in the room, I said, it is not your job to turn us into good men, but you will be shocked at what a critical role you play in that process. Nothing outside of my gratitude for Christ's sacrifice for me, because you can't earn that. You can only allow the gratitude
Amen.
to push you to do good things. But outside of my gratitude for that, the most powerful thing in my life, and really the physical manifestation, the day-to-day physical manifestation of my gratitude and my desire to want to be a better man is there in my wife and children. It's one of the reasons why I think God created marriage and why it's so important and why it's a reflection of his relationship with the church, is that idea of this is a woman that I want to live. I want to be the man she thinks I am, right? I want to be the man she thinks I am.
Okay, so that was what Nick Freitas had to say on, the role, the essential role that women play in men's transformation and in motivating men and incentivizing them to do the hard thing and make something of themselves. And like he said, I mean, outside of his relationship with Jesus Christ and his desire to serve the one who has ransomed him, there is no greater motivator than his wife and children. And that guy's a very well-respected dude. He has a lot of really good things to say that I really enjoy, but that just rings so true for me, guys. This idea that we're attempting to get men to make something of themselves. We're attempting to motivate and incentivize them to do hard things by offering them rewards that are so subpar, that are so mediocre, that are so less than God's motivators, that we're basically, we're not giving them a reason to get off their butt. They have, men today are lazy sometimes, and, just like all people, there are problems with the way some of the men act. And one reason that they are lazy sometimes, and that they are not choosing the hard road and not being a contributing and functioning member of society, is that they have no reason to, because their main motivation, their main incentive has been removed. The goal of marriage is now not encouraged by, sadly, a huge swath of the population in the United States, both Christian and secular. And for whatever reason, this problem presents itself, be it the amount of failed marriages people have seen in the past, or the idea that marriage is confining and it limits your sexual experimentation and therefore happiness, or the idea that marriage is just a piece of paper. All of these false narratives are sowing a great deal of harm for particularly young men, again, because marriage is one of the best choices that a man can make. And I'm going to give you the reasons why. Look at your screen today if you're on YouTube and read this with me. This is an article that I wrote, like I said, 4 years ago. The article is entitled Why Marriage Should Be Standard Practice. It was published on August 11th, 2020. And without further ado, I just want to read this to you. I want to cover as much as I possibly can of this article today, because again, this is detailing, the reasons that most men, by far the great, majority of men, should get married. And it's going to hopefully give you guys some motivators that will help men actually make good choices instead of these terrible motivators that we're giving them as alternatives to marriage. And so let's read this together. It says, in today's culture, getting married is often not perceived as a positive course of action. Young people today are frequently advised by collective culture to postpone getting married for as long as possible. That is certainly true. I'm going to get into this later in the article, but the average age of first marriage for women in 1960 was about 20 years old, and the average age of first marriage for men in 1960 was about 23. Fast forward, 80 years, and now, well, not quite 80, but a long time, to the modern day era, the average age of first marriage for men now is about 30, 29 or 30, and the average age of first marriage for women is about 27. So it's gone up. about 7 years for both men and women. We postponed marriage 7 years further into the future than we did back then. And so that's undoubtedly true. I can get the sources for that are in this video, but you could definitely check them out if you're interested. It says, in this article, I'm going to address why marriage as a standard choice should be reprioritized and give several reasons that it should be the standard choice for humanity. In the first section, I will debunk several religious arguments that have been used to justify the decline of marriage. In the second section, I will detail the plethora of scientific, medical, physical, emotional, and statistical benefits marriage entails. By the way, guys, I have a cold. Sorry about that. And sadly, this is definitely true. I mean, marriage is, both not condemned, but it's not encouraged by both secular and Christian circles now as much as it should be. Sometimes people will just assume that the secularists are the ones saying marriage is not a good idea, the ones, pushing for this life of free sexual experimentation and zero, ties, permanent relationships, and this idea of being just free in the wind, being able to do whatever the heck you want. And that is a secular argument. One argument that's been used by Christians to, lapse people into this state of passivity when it comes to the purpose that God has called them for towards marriage is the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians when he says that it's better to be married, or it's better to be married than to burn with passion. But before that, he says that it's actually marriage is not required, and he wishes all could live unmarried as he does. And we're going to get into that verse and what he actually means by that, and what that verse is actually telling us, because it's not what is. It does not teach that marriage is not the road for the vast majority of people. Instead, it teaches just the opposite, and I'm going to show you why as we read the article. But it says, as a member of Generation Z, the independent self-sufficiency freaks, I will likely be in treacherous territory by suggesting that marriage should be the standard practice for all people across the board as opposed to singleness or cohabitation. However, I'm going to argue for marriage nonetheless. Today, I submit to you the idea that with the exception of supernatural gifting, marriage is the correct choice for every person born on God's green earth. In other words, marriage should be the conventional option for everyone and should be chosen by most. For believers, there are two common counter-arguments to the idea that marriage should be standard practice. Number one, Paul's pro-singleness writings in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and two, the incorrect statement that Jesus never married. And it is true that Jesus had no earthly spouse, but people will use this because Christians are called to be like Jesus to say that Christians should sometimes never get married. Some of them will say this, and it's never taught within Christian circles that you should not get married. But what is taught is that it's an option, and there are two options: that you can live single or you can live married, and that both of these life choices are just kind of not a matter of calling or purpose, or there's not one that you're made for. It's kind of like you can just choose whatever you want and live a good life, and that's not true. I'll detail why later, but it says, while it is true that Paul discusses singleness as a gift in his letters, as I will address shortly, it is not true that our Lord and Savior is unmarried. Jesus is married to you. And what I mean by this statement is Jesus' entire mission in coming to earth was to restore the connection between God and people and reestablish the relationship there. And the analogy that is often used to portray that is the church being the bride of Christ. It confounds me to no end that there are people who will say Jesus never married as an argument that you should not get married, when Jesus' entire mission in coming to earth was to rescue the church and redeem his bride. And so I think it's not in alignment with Scripture to use the argument that Jesus never married to support the idea that a man or a woman should not choose the road of marriage, because in all likelihood, that is the road they are chosen for. And I'm going to explain why later in this article. It says, for a believer as the bride of Christ to argue that marriage should not be standard on the basis that Jesus is a bachelor would be highly illogical. Just as a wife cannot argue that her husband is single, the believer cannot argue that Jesus is unmarried. And while it is true that Jesus did not get married physically during his physical time on this earth, through his proposal on the cross, he painted a very important spiritual principle. This should not be perceived as a mere option for us to recreate and illustrate in our lives if we wish. And again, I'm not saying everybody should get married. I do think there's a small percentage of people who are not made for that road, but I think it is just that, a small percentage. And sadly, the current rate of marriage that we're seeing as of, I believe, 2017 is 49% of adults ages 18 and older being married. I think is an insane number. So less than half is of adults being married. So 51% not choosing the goal of marriage, I think is insane. And it's definitely not following the example of Christ. And I think Paul would roll in his grave if he saw that statistic was a present reality and was being, reinforced by people using his writings that marriage was not required. But let's continue here. He says, marriage and family are the most marriage and family are the most accurate pictures of our relationship with God that we have, and they should not be presented as mere possibility for the individuals to choose if he or she so desires. As for the second argument, Paul does indeed discuss the benefit of remaining unmarried, concerning and concerned with only affairs of God. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he even goes on to say that he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. 1 Corinthians 7:38. However, before either of these statements have been made, Paul makes it clear that he has no command from the Lord regarding this issue. In other words, it's an opinion and advice on Paul's end. And as he had previously alluded, he had a special gift to remain unmarried. He's clearly biased. He has the ability to remain unmarried, presumably without harmful consequence. We're not told in Scripture, but I think that Paul didn't live a sinful life full of pornography addiction. Well, pornography wasn't a thing back then, but prostitution, immoral sexual relationships, fornication, etc. And so, by using logic, you can assume that he was able to remain unmarried without harmful consequence. Now, most people, I would argue today, are not capable of doing that. If you were to, I've often said, guys, if you were to poll like just a random selection of young, solid followers of Jesus who are men, and you were to actually just ask them, what percentage of you, like, raise your hand if you are currently engaging in pornography use, the amount of hands I think that would go up in that room would surprise you. And by surprise you, I mean it would be like every single man in the room would be raising his hand if he was being honest. Now, again, we can lie, but I think almost every single man who is unmarried, and again, I could be wrong here, but in my experience, and I've met a lot of guys, almost every single man who is, unmarried cannot honestly say he is free from porn. Think about that statement for a second. Almost every single man in the world today who is unmarried cannot honestly say that he is free from porn use. That is sobering, guys. That is sobering. Porn is very clearly if you are a believer, it's very clearly in conflict with how you are called to live as a believer. So the fact, again, I can't say that it's fact because I don't know this for sure, but the assumption based on an educated guess that most men are addicted to porn who are unmarried, in fact, almost all of them, I would say, are. Now, there are men who are not addicted to porn who are unmarried, but those are extremely rare. So the fact that that is happening within the church is shocking to me. And the prescription that I sadly hear pastors giving for that is, white knuckling it, or just surrendering yourself to the Lord, which I would agree with, but I don't think that looks like trying to white knuckle it through singleness, avoiding porn for the rest of your life when you're inundated with a sexual stimulus that produces a 200 or 300% increase in dopamine upon sight. That's insane to me. There are some dragons that it is stupid of men to attempt to fight instead of, I would say, taking God's way of escape, that is marriage. And people will then just throw all kinds of stones at me for saying that, being married does not solve porn addiction. And I never use those words. I said that I'm just trying to draw an illustration here for you that, like, I believe, and I can't prove this. So just use your own good judgment and the advice of the Holy Spirit and those mentors in your life who are wiser and older than yourself and Scripture to measure my words against. But, like, I believe firmly in my heart that if the entire world had a lasso of truth around it, like in Wonder Woman, if they were compelled to tell the truth.
The lasso of Hestia compels you to reveal the truth.
But it's really hot.
And you asked the entire world the question, both married and unmarried men, are you free from porn? All of the single men, I believe like 99% of the single men would say no. I believe a far greater percentage of the married men would say yes. far greater. The reason being, the married men actually have the genuine article, and the single men have not only do they not have the genuine article, but they're constantly bombarded by culture with counterfeits that would seek to dissuade them from pursuing God's road for them. And so that's just what I think about this. Let me know if you guys think that's right or wrong. But I mean, that's my take on the world right now. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. Give me your thoughts through the YouTube comments or comments on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. According to the Passion Translation, these are the words of Paul. He says, "I wish that all of you could live unmarried as I do, yet I understand that we are all decidedly different, with each having a special grace for one thing or another." Paul's gift was clearly the ability to remain unmarried without harmful consequence. I'm not arguing that every single person should get married. I do not believe that dictation is mine to make. It is absolutely possible for a believer to be called to singleness as Paul was. But the point I'm trying to make in this article is that it's not 51% of the population. That is an extremely rare gift.
That is a rare gift.
And you might say, well, what's your reasoning for that? I would say because everyone's addicted to porn. Do you think God's plan is that everybody is in sin their whole life? I don't think so. I think God's plan is you living the life that God's called you to live when it comes to your sexuality and living a sexually upright life. And if literally 99% of unmarried men are failing in that regard, we're doing something wrong. And I think it's postponing marriage and declining the road of marriage personally, amidst other things. But I think that's a huge reason that we have the porn addiction that we see today. Because porn really does lose its power when you have the genuine article present. I've not struggled with porn one single time since I got married. Not one single time. Okay? I struggled with porn every bit as much, if not more, than your average guy before I got married. But the second I got married, I have not struggled with it one single time. I've been married over a year and a half, coming up on 2 years. Try and tell me that's just coincidence. It is not. It is not. And people will throw stones at me. They'll say, especially people who have seen marriages where there was porn addiction involved in the marriage. And I understand that happens. I'm not discounting that. And I do acknowledge that married people have addictions sometimes. But I'm saying is if you stacked all the married men up and, who are addicted to porn, and then you stacked all the single men up who are addicted to porn, the single men category would be like 50 times bigger than the married men category, because I think marriage is God's solution to a sexual drive that I believe God's given you. It's his way of living a healthy sexual life. And so to decline that, I think, is foolish, and that's why we see men who are single struggling with pornography today. Continuing on with the article, it says, he was the unconventional exception to a providential standard. If a person has a gift, he has something that isn't common. When Paul implied that he had a gift to remain unmarried, this naturally suggests that marriage is and should be the standard option, and I hold to that to this day. Paul acknowledged that he had a gift to remain unmarried. A gift means that it is not common. And he also acknowledged that we all had gifts for one thing or another. So he was not prescribing his gift for everybody who did not have it. I think it's extremely dangerous to tell men who have a sexual drive that God has called them to singleness. I think that's a gross misrepresentation of the scripture, and it's also firmly against wisdom and the advice of wisdom, because you're encouraging men to take a lifetime of battles with prostitution, hookup culture, pornography, sexual sin that they would not otherwise be inundated with if they had the genuine article of a healthy sexual relationship with a woman that God has prescribed for humanity. It says, today, culture does not portray marriage as the standard or norm. My problem is not with individuals who are called by God to remain unmarried, but rather with a system which seeks to perpetuate the idea that marriage is not the natural inclination of humankind, but rather a morally neutral matter of individual preference. Marriage is not an inconsequential option. It's a fundamental standard that should be pursued by most of humanity, and to reject it should require a spiritual gift. And this is the statement that the church is failing in right now. We are endorsing the choice of young believers to remain unmarried as God's call for their life when they are clearly not called to that. Exhibit A, they're watching porn every day. They have totally, their sex drive is out of control, and they're satisfying it with lust. They're satisfying it with sin, instead of satisfying it the way God designed it to be satisfied to the fullest potential. And I would say that's the only way that God has designed your sexual drive to be satisfied is through a committed, intimate relationship with a flesh and blood woman, i.e. marriage. Continuing on, it says, and yet many people today are declining marriage out of individual preference, but the choice between marriage and singleness should not be left to preference. Why? Because preferences can be shaped by abuses, distortions, and false perceptions. Marriage is a matter of purpose. Marriage is a fundamental piece of what it means to be truly human, and for an individual to reject it should require more than just whim or opinion or a want that is shaped by your past history. It says declining marriage, the providential standard for humanity established on the sixth day of the world, should require what Paul would call a special grace, a charismatic impartation, a spiritual calling of God. Yet we live in a world where nothing is asked of a person who wishes to remain unmarried, other than, is that what you want? Or is that what God has called you to? And I would say you can answer that question, yes, but if the actions of your life say differently, then maybe you need to evaluate if that's really the road God has called you to. I'm tired of seeing people saying, I'm called to marriage, and they're addicted to porn, and they're living sexually immoral lives. So basically, the indicator that God has given to them that they're designed for marriage, they're ignoring and satisfying and satiating with sin. Does nobody else see the hypocrisy there and the problem with that? Like, that is a huge problem. I'm tired of us. Man, I am ready to say if you have a sex drive and have no control over it, you are designed to be married. And I don't mean that in the sense that like you can do whatever you want within the confines of marriage. I mean that you're designed to move towards the goal of marriage and a healthy sexual relationship with a woman. You can't just sit in singleness for your whole life, sinning, and, saying that, yes, this is what God's called me to. It's like, no, son, I don't think it is. I think God's called you to marriage, and you're choosing to rebel against that inclination, that purpose that he's given you. And you're choosing to pursue your own way of satisfying your sexual passions in immoral ways. And I know that, again, people can sin in the confines of marriage. I understand this. But I would say, again, I'm going to reference you to my original point. There are far less married men, in my opinion, who are addicted to porn than there are single men. There are far less married men engaging in unwanted and immoral sexual behavior than there are single men. And so, I just think marriage is the solution, guys. I'm not saying it'll fix all your problems, but it is God's solution. It's God's intent. And so to say that, 51% of the population is excused from that, and rightfully so, I think it's just wild. Because just look at how they're living, guys. Just look at how they're living. Moving on, it says, to quote one author and speaker, Paul said, being called not to marry is a gift from God, which means you need a gift to not marry. That's Chris Valentin. In stark contrast, today's culture says marriage is an option, which means you need no reason to remain single. Like when people say, I don't know that I want to get married, I just want to remain unsingle, they're not hit by the church with any questions. They're just hit with a, yes, I understand. Amen. Blessings to whatever you're doing, brother. Like, that is so wrong. Marriage is the clear road. And is the clear standard for humanity, as I'm going to get into further into this article. And so if somebody is, saying, hey, I don't feel called to do that, I feel called to do something else, a good question for them would be, why? Tell me why you feel called to do something else. Because it's not an inconsequential decision. It's not a small decision, and it's not a decision that comes without consequence. Sheesh. I'm amazed at the amount of people who can hear the statement, I just don't know that I'm going to get married, and then not ask that young person questions. Yikes. Far too many individuals today are declining a providential standard out of women not calling, according to one source. In Greek culture, marriage was so universally accepted and pursued that the Greek words for husband and man are the same. And the Greek words for woman and wife are the same. By the way, your New Testament is Greek. Greeks were so strongly in favor of marriage that they had no word to describe a woman other than wife, and they had no word to describe a man other than husband. To quote one source, the Greeks believed that a woman was made to be a wife and a man was made to be a husband. I would argue that the Greeks had a healthier view of marriage in this respect than many modern-day Americans. The decline of a providential standard is my next subheading. It says, unlike the Greeks in modern-day America, we teach our children that marriage is an option, not a norm. We say things like, only get married if you want to. And we present the option to marry as a choice to our children. I'm not going to raise my children that way. My children are going to be raised knowing that they're being raised to be a husband and to be a wife. I'm not going to raise my children and give them no vision, no purpose, no calling, and say, do whatever the heck you want, because that's how you end up with children making dysfunctional decisions when they're older. They have no vision, no purpose. Children aren't designed to just be set loose into the wild. They're designed to be guided and shown the way that leads to life. And And I know that I'm kind of shouting from a high horse in this because I'm not a parent yet, but I will be one day, and that is how I will be raising my children based on not only the experience of my life and how I've seen other people raise their children, but also in the way that I've been raised and the success and the gratitude that I have for my parents' success in raising children. Because of this, more and more people are choosing to bypass marriage and embrace the consequences of that decision. Let's explore where the marriage is optional philosophy began. How did we get here is my next subheading. Marriages between 1870 and 1980 tended to hover around a pretty stable number per thousand per year. However, in the years since, by the way, all these are my sources. If you'd like the link to this article, it will be in the show notes. You can check out my sources there. It says, however, in the years since 1980, the number of marriages per thousand has been declining steadily. In other words, people are getting married less. In fact, today we're seeing the lowest marriage rates we've seen in the last 150 years, including the years of the Great Depression. The USA hit a record low of number of adults married, and it's getting even lower 9 years later, according to Brad Wilcox, associate professor of sociology at the University of Virginia. In 1970, 72% of all adults ages 18 and older were married. Today, it's 49% of adults ages 18 and older are married. Less than half. Less than half. And let's see here. 64 years ago, 72% of adults ages 18 and older were married. What a drop. 30% drop. According to the same source, in 1960, the average age of marriage for men was 23. Today, it's 29. So it's also being postponed later in the future by those who are actually choosing it. The average age of marriage for women in 1960 was 20. Today it's 27. And according to J.L. Zagorski, economist and research scientist for Ohio University, there are several reasons for this decline in marriage, some blaming widening U.S. income and wealth inequality, others pointing the finger at the fall in religious adherence. I don't think either of those are necessarily reason because, again, the religious are in some cases encouraging people to remain unmarried, or they are saying it is a totally valid option and that not everyone is designed for marriage and that not many are designed for marriage, which is a more accurate statement if we look at the stats. Or people cite the increase in education and income of women, so women not needing men financially as much anymore, which I think that is a true reason why marriage has declined. But continue on, it says, in truth, the decline in marriage numbers in recent years is probably due to a combination of factors, not least the steady absolution of necessity for men and women to marry. That's true. We're becoming a more independent society where we need each other less and therefore have to rely on each other less and therefore are, not as inclined to choose hard roads like marriage in order to satisfy our basic human needs. Before the Industrial Revolution, men were more incentivized to marry because it was more difficult to economically and emotionally make one's way through life solo. Many hands were useful, necessary even in the running of farms and agricultural livelihoods. Emotional support pets were not a thing pre-industrial rev, and counterfeit intimacies such as pornography and prostitution were not readily available. If a man was lonely, marriage was the solution. And I would argue that's how it should be. And then we have a loneliness epidemic because men are seeking, again, counterfeits such as pornography and prostitution as ways of satisfying their loneliness problem, which they never will. If you think pornography can satisfy your loneliness problem, if you think you can bond with a computer screen and that satisfies your need for human connection and intimacy with a real flesh and blood woman, you are deceiving yourself. And continuing down that road is not going to land you in a different spot 5 years from now. That's the definition of insanity. Let's keep doing the same thing over and over and assuming we'll get somewhere better next year. That's not how the world works, friends. It says, but today a committed relationship with a woman is seen as optional. It's completely possible for a man to live a financially and emotionally livable life working for an institution to support only himself and his new best friend, dog, which is stupid, by the way. To say that dog is man's best friend is ridiculous. Woman clearly is, and that's how God designed it. Fast forward to a few decades later, and the same thing has happened to women. Today, women constitute about half of the labor force, 46.9% to be exact. Pre-1960s, before women began working away from the home, women largely relied on marriage to live economically and emotionally comfortable lives. With the entrance of women into the workplace, females had less financial need for marriage, and with the rise of feminism, they were steadily conditioned to have less emotional need for marriage. It's no coincidence that according to one source, by the late 1960s, 40% of marriages were ending in divorce. While the women's rights movement accomplished many great things for women, it had the unfortunate side effect of removing female need for matrimony. In other words, regarding the decline of marriage, the women's rights movement was to woman what the Industrial Revolution was to man. That being a distraction that took interest away from the home and put it out into the world. In recent years, humanity has created a culture in which it is easy and fast becoming easier for individuals, both men and women, to live a life without marriage. Because of this, many have chosen to do without it, not out of providential calling, but individual convenience. According to one speaker, we live in a world where it is very easy to live alone. I believe that was Danny Silk. After all, who needs a family when you have a job? Who needs a wife when you have porn? Who needs a penis when you have a vibrator? Who needs children when you have an emotional support lab-rich Chihuahua doodle? Who needs a goodnight kiss when you have the dopamine hit supplied by scrolling social media on an iPhone? Who needs a covenant centered around service to another when you have yoga? So the logic of culture goes. You see, we've slowly built a world where our reliance on anything, especially human connections such as marriage, are no longer necessary in order to get our needs met, or so we think. And this is where I'm going to move into the point of the article being like, you think you can avoid the consequences of marriage by choosing these less than the best counterfeits to what I would argue God's call in your life is, but you really can't do it. There are going to be consequences. You will pay the piper, as Jordan Peterson will say. You can't just choose to ignore God's road and get away with it scot-free, even if you think you have a substitute for God's plan. I say, but in truth, substitutes cannot take the place of originals with any great degree of efficacy. Living alone will simply never replace the benefits of marriage offers to humanity. 4 reasons marriage should be the natural choice is my next subheading. Number 1, marriage improves health. Our belief that marriage is not necessary for supreme human fulfillment is not as grounded in reality as we think. Marriage is one of the most effective choices we have for creating a life of not only stability, but also health, happiness, and contentment. There's a source after that. Men, women, and especially children benefit from marriage in critical ways. Another source. According to one Harvard Medical School article, some scientists have reported that never married men were 3 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease than married men. Another study mentioned in the same article, 3,682 adults were observed and evaluated by scientists over the course of 10 years, even after taking various cardiovascular risk factors into account. Married men of this study had a 46% lower death rate than the unmarried men. What a shocker. A wife helps your heart. According to the same Harvard Health publication, married men have a lower risk of depression and a higher likelihood of satisfaction with life in retirement than their unmarried peers. Being married has also been linked to better cognitive function, a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease, improved blood sugar levels, and better outcomes for hospitalized patients. According to Robert H. Schmerling, senior faculty editor for Harvard Health Publishing, there is fascinating and compelling research suggesting that married people enjoy better health than single people. This is a well-known fact and not disputed by the majority of scientists. If you don't believe me, look it up or investigate the sources I've included in this article. It says Schmerling argues that compared to singles, married people live longer, have fewer strokes and heart attacks, have a lower chance of becoming depressed. No kidding. You have a lower chance of becoming depressed if you actually have intimacy in your life. Wow. It says they are less likely to have advanced cancer at the time of diagnosis and more likely to survive cancer for a longer period of time and survive a major operation more often. To quote another source, married women are generally happier and less stressed than the unmarried. Wow, guys. Wow. Goodness. I'm just taking a breath. I mean, this is something that I'm really passionate about, guys, and I hope that you are beginning to see kind of the consequences of turning down the road of marriage. It says, in addition to medical concerns, the decline of marriage has been deprived men of what David Brooks calls the fortifying influences of female companionship, and as a result, there is a magnanimous toll being taken on single men. In his article, The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake, Brooks points out that many American males today spend the first 20 years of their life without a father and the next 15 without a spouse, and we wonder why there's a depression and loneliness running rampant in the country. That right there is the answer. Two of the relationships, the kinds of relationships that men are designed to have in their life, universally almost, are just gone. Their dads are gone and they don't have a spouse or any kind of romantic relationship whatsoever. Pointing to research done by Kay Heimowitz, he argues that unmarried men are less healthy, alcohol and drug abuse are common, earn less, and die sooner than married men. I say this once again not to argue that singleness has no place, but to make it clear the undeniable reality that most people are made for marriage, and marriage has never been more needed than it is now. By passing it without a special ticket from God is a sprint for trouble and those who wish to decline the road of marriage out of individual interest rather than supernatural calling are perpetuating a cycle of brokenness which drastically affects humanity in general and men in particular. To quote George Akerlof, Nobel Prize winning economist, men settle down when they get married. If they fail to get married, they fail to settle down. And there's this idea going around that men don't settle down upon entering marriage. And that's in complete opposition to what Nick Freitas said and what I believe. And of course, I don't think you need to be wild prior to marriage, but I do think that a woman is a big prompter for your own personal maturity and your own transformation and growth. And that should you choose to decline that, you are missing out on a lot of maturity that you could have happening. It says marriage provides men with the best target for masculine energy and passion, and this is reflected by the better overall health of men who choose to devote their energy to matrimony rather than some other goal. That's from a podcast with Jeff Bethke and Jeremy Pryor that I would highly recommend. One of the best podcasts I've ever heard. It's called The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake. They review David Brooks' article for The Atlantic. Really, really good podcast. Best podcast I've ever heard, and I've listened to hundreds and thousands. Number 2, healthy sexuality necessitates marriage. Sexuality itself is yet another reason for marriage. Men and women with a sex drive who choose to remain unmarried, opting for one-night stands, no strings, flings, and casual sex to satisfy their passions, make themselves vulnerable to STDs, emotional turmoil, and broken family units. It's amazing to me the number of people today that are raising a child alone who will still condone casual sex as a good option. They're sitting in the consequences of a relationship where the man has not sworn to stick around, but has engaged with you in such a way that you can produce a child. And they're still saying that casual sex is an okay idea. It's crazy. And if you think contraception fixed that, by the way, it doesn't. Contraception is actually not contraception. It's supposed to stop pregnancy, but it doesn't always. I know people personally who have gotten pregnant on birth control pills. Condoms don't work sometimes. I mean, you're just taking a risk either way. Like, the only way to avoid getting married with 100% accuracy is to avoid having sex. Moving on, those who think pornography and masturbation are valid substitutions for healthy married sex are deceiving themselves. I think everybody can get behind that. At least most people. The ones who have a good sexual life with their spouse definitely understand that. In addition to being linked to health conditions which adversely affect sexual performance, such as ED and premature ejaculation, pornography has been shown to desensitize the male brain from reality, making people more critical of appearances, tampering with the pleasure centers of the brain, and fostering unrealistic expectations about sexuality. It's absolutely true. You can check out a book called The Porn Myth by Matt Fradd if you're interested in that. Even if pornography didn't detrimentally affect health, from a moral standpoint, it's a questionable practice at best. It's not a stretch to argue that getting off to images and videos of what could be human trafficking or rape victims is morally questionable and sadistic at worst, not to mention the fact that pornography users tend to view more and more deviant and twisted forms of pornography as time goes on. This is absolutely true. Rape being a commonly searched porn category for the past 5 years, coupled with increasingly worse things than rape, which is hard to imagine, and I can't even say them on the internet without getting banned probably, but you can imagine there are worse forms of pornography. And even if all pornography is consensual, which it is not, this does not make it okay. That's an argument that's used by pro-porn advocates. These are all consenting adults. Everybody's wanting to do this. Why are you saying they shouldn't? Because I want to do a lot of things that are stupid, that are bad for me and other people. That doesn't make them okay. Gosh, morality is not dictated by my consent. Just because I say I want to do something does not make that thing good for me or anyone else. Just because a man or woman consents to violent, degrading, unhealthy behavior does not make it okay for us to label that behavior as acceptable. By the way, like 80% of porn has violence in it. I'm defining as violence as chapping, slapping, choking, calling people racial slurs. Like, to quote one author concerning women in the porn industry, it's a manful thing to treat a woman who has forgotten her dignity with dignity nonetheless. I don't care if this woman wants to do what she's doing or not, it's still wrong. For her, me, and the world. I'm getting fired up, guys. I need to take a water break. I didn't bring a water, though, so I'm just kind of stuck. It says, and so many Christians don't seem to realize that there are only two options for living a healthy sexual life. That is true. There are only two options for living a healthy sexual life. Either you're married and engaging in a healthy sexual relationship with your wife, or you're not having sex at all. Sheesh. It says either you're like Paul, created with a supernatural gift to live without sex, or you are like the vast majority of humans designed to operate in this life within the bond of marriage. Raise your hand in the room if you know somebody who's capable of living a totally sexually healthy life outside the confines of marriage. I can't raise my hand. I've never met somebody like that. And again, I know they exist. Like I know people who, well, I don't know because I don't know what they do at night, but I know, I believe there are people who can live without sex, rarely, and live without any form of sexual counterfeit. But I believe those people are rare, very rare. And so to decline God's road for a healthy sexual life, I believe, is a sprint for dysfunction and coping with unhealthy sexual habits that are not good for you, other people. I say the presence of a sex drive within humans indicates both the intention of heaven for them to marry and the moral necessity for them to do so. And again, this statement I'm open to being wrong on, but I have yet to meet a guy who actually, what's the word, can shut down a sex drive without satisfying it using sinful means. Like if you're not married, I want to meet somebody who can literally not have sex and not, masturbate while looking at porn or something like that. I want to see somebody who can live a sexually upright life without sinning. And I don't know any men who can do this without being married. And again, I'm not saying they should do that within the confines of marriage or within the confines of marriage. I'm saying that marriage, a healthy sexual relationship with one woman who you've sworn never to leave in front of God and man and entered a covenant relationship with, is the only way to have a good sexual life that is in alignment with God's plan. It says when humans with a drive for sexual intimacy attempt to go throughout life without embracing marriage, they either settle for immorality and disrespectful behavior, harming themselves and others, or they spend their entire life on the struggle bus trying to restrain their providential design as sexual beings. This being a fool's errand rarely works, and they end up causing themselves and other a great deal of pain anyway. And yet it disturbs me that we continue to encourage people that marriage is just an option and that they can live a totally happy life single, even if God has clearly called them to marriage. By the way, guys, the reason my voice is out is not only because I have a cold, but because I teach for a living. I'm an elementary teacher, an SEL teacher, social and emotional teacher for an elementary school locally. That's actually my career. Podcasting is not my career. I don't make money from this. This is something that I do out of passion and out of a desire to build the kingdom of God and call people to a better way. But the reason my voice is gone is because I'm a teacher and I teach 6 classes a day. And I talk for 40 minutes straight with these kids, man. And so my voice by the end of the week is just tanked. It's just absolutely destroyed. And then in the weekend, I don't even have a break because I do podcasting on the weeks. And this has been, as you guys have seen, just like straight reading for so long. But it says, in other words, individuals have two options to live a healthy life of sexual wholeness and morality. They can either live a life without sex entirely, or they can marry. It's pretty simple, really. Those who cannot live without sex are not made to live without marriage. People who try to live a sexual life outside the context of marriage not only settle for a less than the best sexual experience, but they also often reap negative consequences. I would actually change that to always. This is reinforced by science, stat, and study. Once again, I'm not saying that am I saying that all humans should marry? No. I'm saying that if you have a sex drive and have no control over it, you should. In order to live a life of respect and fullness without being married, a person must either not have a sex drive or have control over it. And by control, I mean you're not looking at porn. Whew. And I'm not saying you should I'm not saying you should enter marriage with a porn addiction, but I am saying that from personal experience, I can say that marriage was the solution to any desire for porn that I had. And so if you're like me, then marriage really does fix your porn problem. There, I said it. And I know that's hard to say on the internet because, some people, and again, there's a lot of people who aren't like me and they're in a marriage and they're looking at porn and they're destroying their wife's confidence and ruining their intimacy and all this. I understand people like that exist. I really do. And I'm not trying to undermine their story. I'm just saying that for me, marriage was the solution for all the incessant and constant struggle with lust on the internet that I had as a teenager. Number 3, my third subheading is healthy children and family demand marriage. The rearing of children and the building of healthy families are other reasons which strongly stand in support of marriage. Those with sincere concern for the well-being of the next generation have no choice but to endorse marriage as standard practice. It has been shown in study after study that children who spring from a healthy marriage live healthier lives than those who are raised by single parents or in cohabiting relationships. Children who grew up with married parents in their life, to quote one source, are 20 to 35% more physically healthy than children from broken homes and enjoy healthier emotional lives as well. In other words, your consequences for remaining unmarried don't just affect you, they affect any children you might have outside of wedlock. Sorry if it's unpopular to say, it's true. Children from married homes are also much less likely to battle impoverishment, to quote one source. 1 in 10 children with married parents lives in poverty. Take away the factor of married parents from the home, and suddenly children reap devastating consequences. Children who are raised by unmarried, cohabiting parents are 6 times more likely to struggle with emotional and behavioral issues. Children who have gone through divorce are 50% more likely to develop health problems. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Cohabitation plays second fiddle. There's no question. I don't think anybody argues that like there is a better living situation for children than in marriage, in a married home. I don't think anybody will argue that just because it's so widely acknowledged based on the data. But here I say that cohabitation plays second fiddle. Some argue that cohabitation is a more desirable alternative to marriage. However, any amount of research clearly reveals cohabitation to be secondary to marriage. And I will say, I believe cohabitation is wrong from a religious standpoint, but even for the not religious, let's use your arguments for a second. If you're not religious and you're listening to the show and you say, what's wrong with me just living with somebody and having all the benefits of emotional and intimate relationship with a woman, but just not entering a marriage with her? Well, one reason is just the fact that your children are not going to benefit from it. And number two, you would never know I would be more confident in a partner who'd signed the paper never to leave than I would be in a partner who had not. Call me distrusting or something like that, but I believe actions speak louder than words. And if somebody's willing to embrace consequences and lawyer fees and a lot of time in court, should she, in order to withdraw from a marriage, and she signs the document saying, yeah, I'm never going to leave, I'm going to be more likely to believe her than I am the girl who's like, yeah, I'm here for an undisclosed amount of time, as long as it's beneficial to me and as long as things work out, which is very vague. You really are just leaving yourself a backdoor out of the relationship, because why wouldn't you get married? Why wouldn't you embrace the consequences instead of remove the consequences for going back on your word? And again, also, I mean, there was another point I was going to make about this, about cohabitation. I'm just going to sit here until I think of it. I'll just read it. I'll probably think of it when I come across it here. It's in this paragraph. Study after study indicates that cohabitation plays second fiddle to marriage in every area of importance. Cohabitation does not produce healthier results than marriage, especially in the areas involving trust, such as faithfulness, financial wisdom, and the ability to act in the best interest of one's partner. An arrangement where individuals leave themselves a backdoor out of the relationship can never produce the atmosphere of complete trust that a healthy, committed marriage offers. That's really my main point. The woman who says she's never going to leave you and her actions back that up by basically putting consequences on herself if she does, her word matters more to me than somebody who either A, doesn't commit to stick around forever, or B, just says she will stick around forever, but her actions don't show that. Restoring the nuptial narrative is, I believe, my last subheading. Thank you guys for your attention. If you made it this far in the video, kudos to you, especially with all my coughing and sneezing and all that. I'm so sorry. But I really didn't want to just give up podcasting this week, because this is something that I'm really passionate about. And it's honestly a discipline for me, guys. I mean, I've done this. I put out 2 episodes a week for 2 years now. I mean, it's not something that I take lightly. Even if I'm sick, like I get it done. So it is what it is. My voice is what it is, friends. Whew. It says, so if married people are healthier than singles, if most humans have a sex drive, which cannot be healthily satisfied without marriage, if children and families are healthier within the context of marriage, and if cohabitation doesn't measure up to marriage, why are marriage numbers declining? Why are so many people staying single, distorting healthy sexuality, or operating in broken homes and shacking up? One answer to that question is that out of a perception fractured in childhood or adulthood, many have either come to consider healthy marriage unattainable or have come to believe marriage itself is a broken entity. And again, the reason for this is because they've seen the vast majority of their experience with marriage is bad marriage. I mean, it's people doing marriage wrong. It's people who are not actually committed to each other for life, who did not mean their vows when they said, till death do us part. And so because people have seen people do marriage that way, the wrong way, they assume that marriage itself is a failed institution and that it's impossible to do it correctly simply because they've never seen anybody do it correctly. And I would say to them, those people, you just need to get out of your circle of friends, buddy. I'm like, I know all kinds of people who have the best marriage. Like, I know there's no such thing as a perfect marriage, but just an amazing marriage that they would be broken and destroyed without. And so I don't know, just find friends who are where you want to be instead of friends who are, drowning in a sewer, and not to insult those people. I'm not being rude, or I sounded condescending when I said that, but what I mean is you want to take advice from people who are where you want to be and not people who have, run the experiment 6 times and failed every time, if that makes sense. And I'm not, again, I can't say this in a way that's not insulting. I just mean, like, I have all sympathy. I feel terrible for people who have been abandoned by their partner or had a failed marriage. Like, I'm not saying those people are somehow less than ideal, friends. That's not what I'm saying. Hopefully you understand the heart of what I'm saying. If you want to be a master at something, you take lessons from a master in that field. A cycle of brokenness has cascaded down the recent decades of American history, perpetuating the flawed view of the idea that marriage is not beautiful. The number of people who wish to remain unmarried because of a flawed perception of marriage is far higher than the number of people who choose to remain unmarried out of a genuine calling of God. We should be seeing less singleness in the world today than we are. Again, 51% of adults ages 18 and older in this country are not married. That's not to say they're not single, but it's to say they're not married. So they're not in a relationship with somebody who is showing with their actions and not just their words that they're in it for the long haul until death do they part. How can we change this? We can overcome our stigmas and tie the knot tight. We can restore the perception of marriage as a beautiful creation. We can pull the original wondrous idea of matrimony out of the mud, adopt it, polish it, and protect it. We can pour our hearts and souls into our marriages, surrounding them with community and mentors who will reinforce them with a hedge of well-being, good intention, experience, and advice. And when, out of its brokenness, culture suggests that marriage should be an option rather than norm, we can stand up, holding aloft the shining treasure for which we daily give our lives. Look across the field of bachelors and bachelorettes swaying in the wind of weighty indecision, and we can say, marriage should be endorsed by all and embraced by most. Then I give my source list here at the end. I hope this article has been insightful for you guys. If you think that I'm uninformed or have not put work into this topic, you are wrong. I have 40 sources in this article and more in other articles that I've written. I'm not being casual about this. I'm not being flippant about this. I have seriously put work and time and thought into this. This is in alignment with my experience. This is in alignment with the will of God. This is in alignment with Scripture. And so I feel confident putting it on the internet. Now, if it's not for you, don't take it. Skip the podcast and go somewhere else. I'm not saying that my life experience is in alignment with everyone else in the world. We've all lived very different lives. But what I am saying is I am doing a disservice to those in my life and in my reach who are similar to myself if I don't put this on the internet. So please don't come at me with this does not belong on the internet because it's bad advice. Because if this advice would have saved me a great deal of pain and useless struggle had I taken it at an earlier age. And so you cannot tell me or convince me that it is useless advice to put on the internet, because this advice was what I needed when I was younger. And should I have had it, my life would have been much easier. And when I did have portions of it, my life was easier. And so again, if you are like me, I hope that saves you. I hope these words help you. Blessings. May the grace and peace of God go with you into this new year. May God bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and fill you with peace and desire to serve and know him better every day. Thank you guys for listening. Hope it's been sobering. Hope it's been revelatory. And I will talk to you next time.